A police officer was patrolling a park and decided to show his power by targeting a man. He hit him with his baton, not knowing that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Seconds later, the officer realized he had messed with the wrong person. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you're from. The afternoon sun hung high over Griffith Park, its golden light filtering through the dense canopy of oak and sycamore trees. The air was warm, but carried a faint breeze that rustled the leaves, providing brief moments of relief from the California heat. Families spread out blankets on the grass, children ran along the walking paths, and joggers moved in steady rhythms, their feet tapping against the pavement. A group of teenagers sat near the playground, their laughter mixing with the chirping of birds, while an elderly couple strolled hand in hand, savoring the peaceful afternoon. Among the many visitors in the park, there was one man who sat apart from the others. He occupied a worn wooden bench near a shaded grove, his posture relaxed, one booted foot resting over the other as he watched a flock of pigeons gather around him. His hands, rough and calloused from years of use, casually tossed bird seed onto the ground. The birds responded eagerly, fluttering and pecking at the kernels. He observed them with an almost meditative stillness. He wore faded blue jeans, a simple brown shirt, and a leather belt with a silver buckle that had long since lost its original shine. A well-worn cowboy hat shielded his face from the sun, casting a shadow over his strong, weathered features. His beard, neatly trimmed but showing the full marks of age, framed a face that bore the quiet authority of a man who had seen and done more than most. Chuck Norris sat there, unmoved by the constant hum of the city around him. He had spent his life in motion, training, fighting, teaching, protecting. But now, in the stillness of this park, he simply existed in the moment. There was no need for action, no urgency, no battle to be fought. For now, he was just an old man feeding pigeons, and that was enough. Distantly, the sound of heavy boots crunching against the pavement broke through the natural ambience of the park. It was a deliberate stride, one that commanded attention whether people wanted to give it or not. The sound grew louder, closer, until the man wearing those boots came into view. Officer Dan Cross was a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a perfectly pressed LAPD uniform. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world around him, concealing the sharp, calculating eyes beneath. His utility belt was loaded with tools of enforcement: a baton, handcuffs, a radio, a taser, and a standard-issue firearm, each placed with precision, polished and ready. His uniform was pristine, his posture rigid, his presence exuding the kind of authority that demanded compliance. But for those who had encountered him before, there was another quality to Officer Cross that wasn't listed on his badge. He was a man who enjoyed power, not for the purpose of serving, but for the ability to impose his will on others. He wasn't known for kindness, nor for patience. The people of this neighborhood had learned long ago that challenging him only led to trouble, and most did their best to avoid him altogether. As he patrolled the park, his eyes roamed over the crowds with quiet judgment. He took in the joggers, the families, the dog walkers, but his gaze settled on the lone man sitting on the bench. Something about him felt off, too still, too calm. He wasn't a jogger catching his breath, nor a parent watching over a child. He was just sitting there motionless, feeding birds. Cross's lips curled slightly in disdain. He had seen men like this before, old, stubborn relics who thought they could do whatever they pleased. They were the type to disregard authority, to think themselves beyond the rules that governed everyone else. In his mind, there was no reason for anyone to sit in the park alone for this long if they weren't exercising, working, or contributing to society in some tangible way. They were wasting space. Without hesitation, he veered off the main path and started toward the bench, his boots hitting the ground with purpose as he closed the distance. He flexed his fingers once, feeling the reassuring presence of his baton at his side. This wouldn't take long. A few firm words, a display of authority, and the old man would be on his way. A few passers-by noticed his approach. A woman walking her dog slowed slightly, her eyes flicking between the officer and the man on the bench. A group of young men, sitting near a picnic table, exchanged quiet glances, recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. They had seen Cross at work before, and they knew what happened when someone didn't comply fast enough. The officer came to a halt directly in front of the bench, his shadow falling over Chuck. He stood with his feet planted wide, hands on his belt, radiating the kind of energy that all but announced his intentions. Chuck didn't move. The birds continued pecking at the seeds, unbothered by the presence of the officer looming over them. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and warm asphalt. Cross exhaled through his nose, irritation already bubbling beneath the surface. This was the part where most people looked up, recognized his authority, and responded accordingly. But the old man remained exactly as he was, as if he hadn't even noticed Cross was there. That wasn't going to fly. The officer shifted his weight slightly, clearing his throat. When he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. But Chuck Norris did not react. He did not acknowledge the words, nor did he so much as glance upward. His hands remained steady, dropping another handful of bird seed onto the pavement. The pigeons cooed and fluttered, oblivious to the growing tension. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through Cross's mind. Not quite confusion, not quite hesitation, but something close. For the first time in a long time, his presence alone was not enough. He wasn't used to that, and he didn't like it. He took a step closer, the polished tip of his boot stopping inches from Chuck's foot. His hand instinctively shifted toward his baton. He had no patience for defiance, especially not from some old man who thought he could ignore the law. The sun continued its slow descent, the shadows stretching ever so slightly longer across the ground. Yet Chuck Norris remained still. The air in the park had changed, though most of the people enjoying their afternoon remained unaware of it. The laughter of children and the rhythmic steps of joggers continued as before, the hum of the city beyond the trees providing a distant backdrop. Yet in the small circle of space surrounding the bench, the atmosphere had become heavier, more charged, like the moments before an approaching storm. Officer Dan Cross stood over Chuck Norris, his presence an unspoken demand. The polished leather of his boots glinted in the sunlight, his posture rigid with authority. He had given the order, and he expected compliance. That was how it always worked. But Chuck Norris did not move. The old man remained as he was, his posture unshaken, his hand dropping another handful of bird seed onto the ground. The pigeons did not scatter. The bench beneath him did not creak with the weight of his shift and motion. If he had heard Cross speak, there was no indication of it. The lack of response irritated the officer more than any words could have. People did not ignore him, not when he was in uniform, not when he stood with his feet planted and his voice firm. He was the one who gave orders, and others obeyed. It was a simple equation, a predictable outcome. Yet here, in the middle of a public park, a single old man sat as if the badge on Cross's chest meant nothing. Cross's fingers flexed at his sides. He had encountered stubborn people before, drunks, street punks, the occasional protester who thought they were making a statement. But this was different. There was something unsettling about the way this man remained still, as if he wasn't ignoring Cross out of defiance, but simply because the officer wasn't worth acknowledging. A flicker of uncertainty passed through his mind, but he buried it beneath his usual instincts. When words didn't work, action did. With a sharp motion, Cross lifted his baton and struck it hard against the wooden bench, inches from Chuck's leg. The impact sent a sharp crack through the air, startling nearby birds into a sudden flurry of wings. A few people glanced over at the noise, their curiosity momentary, before they returned to their conversations and strolls. Chuck remained unmoved. Cross's patience frayed. His voice cut through the afternoon air, louder this time, sharp with impatience. The authority in his tone had always been enough before. It was the weight of the badge, the years of unquestioned obedience he had come to expect. He had spent his career molding his presence into something that commanded submission, but the old man merely shifted his hat back slightly, his face still shadowed beneath the brim. The motion was slow, deliberate, and though subtle, it carried an air of something deeper. It was not the movement of a man cowed into submission, nor was it an attempt to escalate the situation. It was something else entirely. Cross clenched his jaw, his gut tightening in a way that he didn't like. He had meant to startle the man, to make him understand who was in charge. Yet it was Cross himself who felt a strange, creeping sensation of uncertainty. This wasn't normal. Still, he wasn't about to back down. With an impatient huff, he reached forward and seized Chuck's shoulder, his grip firm and meant to be commanding. The muscles beneath his fingers were solid, far more than he had expected for a man who looked old enough to be retired. Then, before he could even register what was happening, his own wrist was caught in an iron grip. It wasn't fast nor violent. It was smooth, controlled, and utterly effortless. Cross barely had time to react before the pressure on his wrist increased slightly. Not enough to cause real pain, but enough to send a clear, undeniable message. A shock of alarm coursed through the officer's chest, primal and immediate. He had faced resistance before, suspects who ran, men who fought back in a blind, flailing panic. But this was something else. This was the grip of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. For the first time, Cross's confidence faltered. He wrenched his arm back, and to his relief, the old man let go. His wrist was unharmed, but the skin where he had been held still felt the lingering presence of that grip, as if the weight of it had been burned into his nerves. Cross took a step back, inhaling sharply. The sensation was foreign to him, this sudden, unspoken reversal of control. He set his jaw. No, he was not going to let an old man make him look weak. His baton was still in his other hand, and he adjusted his stance, gripping it more firmly this time. There would be no warning strike against the bench. This time, he would make sure the man got the message. Raising the baton, he aimed for the old man's shoulder, fully expecting him to take the hit like anyone else, flinching, recoiling, acknowledging the dominance of the law. But as the baton swung down, Chuck moved. It was a small motion, almost imperceptible, a shift of his weight, a simple turn of his upper body. But it was enough. The baton cut through empty air, missing its mark entirely. And before Cross could react, Chuck's hand was on his wrist again. This time, there was no hesitation. In one seamless motion, the baton was removed from his grip, not yanked, not wrestled away, just taken. Cross's heart pounded in his chest. He had trained for hand-to-hand encounters, had spent years perfecting the techniques that officers relied on to subdue suspects, to maintain control. And yet here, in a matter of seconds, his weapon had been taken from him as if he were a child holding a toy. The old man did not raise the baton, did not brandish it in threat. He merely held it as if weighing it, considering whether or not it was worth keeping. Then, slowly, deliberately, he let it drop to the ground. Cross stared at it, his breath uneven. The atmosphere between them had shifted in a way that he could not define. The power dynamic he had relied on, uniform, weapon, authority, had all been stripped away, reduced to nothing by a man who had barely moved. A few people nearby had noticed the exchange, their murmurs low and uncertain. A couple of teenagers whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Cross and the old man. Others simply watched, their curiosity tempered by caution. Cross's hands curled into fists. His pride burned hot in his chest, a mix of anger and something far more dangerous, something close to fear. He had only one option left. His fingers twitched toward his holster, and Chuck Norris was already watching the baton lay on the ground between them, an inanimate object that had just moments ago represented control, now discarded at the feet of its former wielder. It was nothing more than a useless piece of wood and metal. Officer Dan Cross stood frozen, his breath shallow and uneven. He was acutely aware of the small but growing number of onlookers, their murmurs floating through the warm air like a rising tide. A few had paused in their walks, their conversations faltering as they took in the scene. Others lingered at a distance, drawn by the tension that now simmered in the space between the two men. But Cross's focus had narrowed to the old man before him. The way he had taken the baton, it had been so fluid, so effortless, as if the movement had required no more thought than flicking a speck of dust from his sleeve. There had been no aggression, no unnecessary force. And then, just as easily, he had let it fall, as if to show that he had no need for such a thing, that it was beneath him. Cross's fingers twitched at his side. His entire body burned with frustration, with a gnawing sense of something he refused to name. It wasn't just that he had been disarmed. It was the way it had happened, the way the control had slipped from his grasp before he even understood what was happening. No, he would not stand for this. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the park. He reached for his belt, for the one thing that could not be taken from him so easily. His hand closed around the cool, familiar grip of his service weapon. It was instinct, the ultimate show of force, the final word in any confrontation. And yet, as his fingers curled around the holster, his movement slowed. A thought, sharp and unwanted, cut through his growing anger. This wasn't a street fight. He wasn't dealing with some punk looking to make a name for himself. Something was wrong. Cross had been a police officer for nearly 15 years. He had faced all manner of resistance, angry drunks, cornered criminals, desperate men with nothing to lose. He had been in dangerous situations before. He had drawn his gun more times than he cared to count. But this was different. The man in front of him wasn't reacting the way people normally did. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his muscles, no telltale shift in stance that signaled preparation for a fight. There was only stillness, an unshakable calm that made the air feel heavier, as though something inevitable was approaching. And his eyes, for the first time, Cross truly met the old man's gaze. They were sharp, unblinking, steady. They held no malice, no arrogance, no smugness, just observation and patience, as if watching and waiting for Cross to make his choice. A strange sensation crawled up the officer's spine, something dangerously close to doubt. He had never felt this way before. His grip on the gun slackened slightly. A bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck. The world around them seemed to contract. The park, the trees, the people, all faded into the background. There was only the heat of the sun on his face, the sound of his own breathing, and those unwavering eyes locked onto his. A voice in his head, quiet but insistent, whispered, "Don't do it." But pride was a dangerous thing. His fingers tightened on the grip once more, and in a single fluid motion, he drew the weapon from its holster. Before he could even fully lift it, something changed. The old man moved. Later, Cross would struggle to explain what had happened. He would try to piece together the sequence of events, but everything had unfolded too quickly, too smoothly, as if time itself had momentarily bent around the moment. 1 second, the gun was in his hand. The next, his wrist was seized in a grip of steel. There was no pain, no forceful yank, no struggle, just precise control. The same way the taser had been taken from him. The gun was now slipping from his grasp, and then it was gone. His own weapon, the thing that had always given him the upper hand, now rested in the calloused hands of the man before him. Cross stood there stunned, his hand still curled uselessly in midair, as if his body hadn't yet processed that it was empty. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone gasped. A man muttered a low curse under his breath. The weight of eyes upon him pressed against his skin, heavier than any physical blow. Chuck Norris turned the gun over once in his hand, examining it briefly as if testing its balance. His face remained unreadable. Then, with the same deliberate motion as before, he bent down, placed the gun on the ground beside the baton, and straightened. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Cross swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The realization of what had just occurred settled over him like a thick fog. He had lost completely, and he hadn't even seen it coming. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his mind sluggish, as if trying to process a new reality that didn't fit within the framework he had always known. He had been trained for physical altercations, trained to subdue, to control, to enforce. But this was something else, a deeper, more humiliating defeat. And the worst part, the old man had never even thrown a punch. Cross's hands clenched into fists at his sides. A flush of heat crawled up his neck, shame and fury intertwining in his chest. The murmurs of the crowd were louder now, filling the space around him like a pressure he could not escape. A sharp movement caught his eye. Someone was holding up a phone, recording. The realization struck like a blow. This wasn't just an embarrassment, this was evidence. He felt something unravel inside him, something deep and ugly. He had never been in this position before. Outmatched, outmaneuvered, outplayed, in front of witnesses. And if this video made its way online, no, he wouldn't let it end like this. His body moved before his mind could stop it, fueled by anger, by sheer, desperate instinct. He lunged, a last attempt to reclaim what had been taken. But Chuck Norris had already seen it coming. A moment stretched thin between them, heavy with inevitability. Cross moved, but the decision had already been made before his muscles had even tensed. It was not strategy, not skill, just raw, blind instinct. The desperate reaction of a man drowning in his own failure, reaching for control where none remained. He lunged, his body twisting forward in a reckless, uncalculated motion. His hands, empty of both weapon and authority, grasped for something, anything, to pull himself back from the abyss he had unwittingly stepped into. But desperation was never a substitute for precision, and precision was something Chuck Norris had spent a lifetime mastering. Cross did not see what happened next. At least, not in a way that he could fully process. One moment he was moving. The next, his world had shifted. His forward momentum vanished as something impossibly swift and controlled redirected him. His wrist, his own wrist, which only seconds ago had been reaching for the old man, was suddenly caught and twisted, not with pain, not with brute force, but with a pressure so perfect, so exacting, that his body had no choice but to follow where it was led. His knees buckled. He was weightless for the briefest of moments, his vision tilting as the world turned sideways. And then, just as quickly, he was on the ground. There was no harsh impact, no brutal crash of body against pavement. No pain, no injury, just movement. A transition so smooth, it barely felt real. 1 second, he was standing. The next, he was on his back, staring up at the sky. For a long moment, he did not understand. The murmur around him grew louder, creeping in from the edges of his consciousness. He heard them, registered the voices, the gasps, the whispered disbelief. But it all felt distant. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and his mind clawed at explanations that refused to form. Then reality crashed in. He had been taken down effortlessly, without a single wasted motion, without violence, without anger, just efficiency. He had lost. The shame came first, hot and suffocating, settling into the pit of his stomach like a lead weight. Then came the panic. He had lost control. And worse, people had seen it. Not just a handful of passers-by, but a crowd, their numbers growing by the second, drawn in by the undeniable magnetism of the moment. Some were holding up phones, their screens glinting in the sunlight. This was more than humiliation. This was exposure. His pulse pounded in his skull as he fought to sit up, to reclaim even a fraction of his authority. But before he could move, a shadow passed over him. Chuck Norris stood above him, his expression unreadable. There was no smugness in his face, no gloating, no trace of satisfaction. If anything, there was only calm assessment, as if he were simply waiting to see what Cross would do next. And in that moment, the officer understood something that sent an even deeper chill through his body. The old man had held back, not because of hesitation, not because of luck, but because he had chosen to. There had been no struggle, no contest of strength. Chuck had decided how this encounter would end long before Cross had even drawn his gun. The weight of that realization was unbearable. Cross's jaw clenched as he scrambled to his feet, his body tense with frustration. He knew better than to attack again. He knew there was no recovering from what had just happened. But pride was a stubborn thing. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment in their silence. He had to do something. He turned sharply, scanning the park, searching for something to latch onto, some authority he could still wield. And then, like an answer to an unspoken prayer, he spotted the approaching figures of 2 more officers cutting through the crowd. They were moving quickly, hands resting near their holsters, their expressions a mix of confusion and alertness. They had seen the commotion from a distance and were closing in fast. Relief flooded Cross's chest. This was his moment to reclaim control. With deliberate force, he straightened his uniform, ignoring the way his body still felt unsteady. He turned to face them, jaw tight, pulse racing. Before they could speak, before they could ask questions, he pointed a rigid finger at Chuck Norris. He assaulted an officer. Cross barked, his voice sharp, authoritative. "I want him in cuffs now." The words were his last weapon, his last attempt to reassert dominance, to rewrite the story before it could be taken from him entirely. For a moment, the approaching officers hesitated. They had seen something, perhaps not everything, but enough to know that the situation was not as clear-cut as Cross wanted it to be. Their eyes flicked between him and the old man, taking in the body language, the silent weight of the moment. Then one of them, an older officer with graying temples and tired eyes, froze mid-step. Recognition flickered across his face, not at Cross, but at the man standing calmly before him. And then his entire demeanor changed. His rigid posture loosened. His hand drifted away from his holster. His gaze, though still sharp, held something new, something close to understanding. He knew who Chuck Norris was. The realization spread like a ripple through the other officer as well. Neither of them moved to reach for their cuffs. Neither of them drew their weapons. They stood still, exchanging a glance that spoke more than words ever could. Cross felt his stomach twist. Something was slipping from his grasp, something more than just control. The narrative he had been trying to build, the version of events he had so desperately wanted to enforce, was unraveling before his eyes. His hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. But then the senior officer spoke. "Dan," he said quietly, "just a name, nothing more." But the tone in his voice, the weight of it, was enough to stop Cross cold. The hush that followed was deafening. He knew, in that instant, that he had lost. Not just the fight, not just the authority he had once held so effortlessly. He had lost something much bigger. And as the realization settled in, as the quiet judgment of his peers surrounded him, he felt the last shreds of his confidence fracture. Chuck Norris had never needed to lay a single punch. The truth had been enough. A hush fell over the park. The quiet that followed the senior officer's words was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something weightier. A realization settling over everyone who had gathered to watch. The air, thick with tension just moments before, now held something else entirely: finality. Officer Dan Cross stood rigid, his body locked in the posture of a man who refused to acknowledge what was happening, even as it unfolded around him. His mind worked furiously, grasping for some foothold, some way to reverse what had already slipped irreversibly from his grasp. But the truth was undeniable. The control he had once wielded so effortlessly was gone. The senior officer took another step forward. He was older than Cross, his face lined with the wear of too many years on the job, his hair graying at the temples. Unlike Cross, his uniform was not pristine, not rigidly maintained for appearance's sake. It had the soft wrinkles of a man who spent more time working than polishing his badge. He looked from Cross to Chuck Norris, then back again, his gaze unreadable. Cross's breath was heavy in his chest, each inhale laced with frustration, with a bitter taste of something he refused to name. "You need to stop," the senior officer said. His voice was even, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that came not from volume, but from experience. Cross's mouth opened. The instinct to argue, to justify, burned in his throat. But he had no argument, not a single excuse that would hold up under the weight of the truth. And worse, he knew it. A shift passed through the watching crowd. Their murmurs were quieter now, no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a growing understanding. People had seen what had happened. They had watched Cross escalate, had watched him try to exert control over a man who had never once raised his voice, let alone his fists. And they had watched him fail. A man in the crowd murmured something under his breath. A woman near him nodded. Another held up a phone, still recording. Cross swallowed hard. The senior officer exhaled slowly, as if he had seen this before, as if he had been here too many times, with too many men who had let power make them reckless. He looked at Cross for a long moment before he spoke again. "Give me your badge." The words landed like a blow. Cross's stomach twisted violently. His skin prickled with heat. His breath caught somewhere between his ribs. His entire world, his entire identity, revolved around the shield pinned to his chest. The authority it granted him. Without it, he was nothing. His hands twitched at his sides. "This isn't necessary," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. The senior officer's expression didn't change. Badge and gun. The order was final. There was no room for negotiation. A fresh wave of shame burned through Cross's body. Slowly, stiffly, he reached for the metal pin to his chest. The weight of it felt different now. He had worn it for years, had carried it like armor, believing it made him untouchable. But it hadn't protected him today. He unpinned it with unsteady fingers and placed it into the senior officer's waiting hand. Then came the gun. This was worse. He had already lost it once today, had already felt the unbearable humiliation of having it taken from him, as if he were a child playing at authority. Now he had to surrender it by choice. The grip was firm in his palm, the weight familiar. He hesitated. The senior officer didn't move, didn't rush him, but his meaning was clear. Cross had no choice. With slow, deliberate motions, he removed the magazine, cleared the chamber, and placed the empty weapon on top of his badge. The moment it left his hands, something inside him fractured. The senior officer gave a small nod, as if he had expected no less. Without another word, he turned and gestured to the younger officer beside him. Escort him out of the park. Cross's jaw locked. He wanted to fight, to resist, to hold on to what was already gone. But there was nothing left to hold. A hand touched his arm, not rough, not forceful, but firm. The younger officer, one he had barely noticed before, now stood beside him, waiting for him to move. He did. The walk to the edge of the park was the longest of his life. Every step felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. He could hear the murmurs behind him, feel the gazes of strangers following his departure. He kept his head up, refusing to look at them, refusing to acknowledge what they saw. A once powerful man, reduced to nothing. By the time he reached the street, the world felt unfamiliar. The uniform he wore no longer carried the same presence. Without the badge, without the gun, it was just fabric, just another set of clothes worn by a man who had lost everything. Behind him, the park carried on. The incident was over, and life was moving forward without him. At the center of it all, Chuck Norris stood exactly as he had before, unmoved, unshaken. A man who had never needed power to prove himself. The crowd, once gathered in uncertainty, now regarded him with something else entirely. Not just respect, but recognition for what he was, for what Cross had never been. And as the former officer stepped out of sight, Chuck, without a word, returned to his bench. The pigeons, unconcerned with human affairs, fluttered back to him, pecking at the seeds he scattered with the same quiet patience he had shown from the start. It was over, and as it had always been, justice had spoken. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more amazing content, and don't forget to share this video with your friends.